ladies and gentlemen, Nicholas Tucker.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you're all awake in this rather warm room, in contrast to outside. But I thought I'd actually start on a very indulgent note and just say how I got interested in fairy tales, because my father was a sort of grim figure with a double M in his own right. He was a linguist, and he travelled to Africa before the war, East Africa, and he was doing orthographies and finding spellings for languages that never had any spellings before. And he also wrote down the stories that he heard from the Bari people. Came back to England, and then he collected them together in a little book called The Disappointed Lion, which we were brought up on. And it's an interesting book because the heroine is a girl, Kidden. And this girl, every story, outwits a lion who's just about to eat her up, and she finds some way of sort of putting him off. Anyhow, my father was then asked to broadcast these stories on Children's Hour. Now, only the older people in the audience here will remember Children's Hour was a children's program on the radio every day at 5 o'clock. And my father read out these stories, and he had all these African instruments which he sang the tunes to, because they had little tunes all the way through these stories. And he enjoyed that, but he said he had some trouble with the presenter, who's a man called Uncle Mac. And that was the name given to Derek McCulloch. And Children's Hour had a resident uncle and a resident aunt. Uncle Mac and Auntie Elizabeth. Auntie Elizabeth was very nice. She wrote the preface to my father's book, May E. Jenkins. But Uncle Mac was something else. And you had to be very careful with him, my father said. And it was some strange schadenfreude that I read an article last year in the London Review of Books which unmasked Uncle Mac as a persistent paedophile. And the Jimmy Savile inquiry, which is now going on in the BBC, has had to go all the way back to 1950 to bring in Uncle Mac as well. But anyhow, I thought that might amuse you, or make you think anyhow. So, fairy tales in my house were sort of quite living, because I could sort of see the people who were telling them, and my father was retelling them. But when I came to give this talk, I told various people who pretended to be interested in Lewis what I said. I'm going to talk about the Grimm Parents. And they all, every one of them said, oh, what an awful lot of parents are going to be talking about. And it's very interesting that people assume that the parents in the Grimm fairy tales are unpleasant and grim people. Absolutely not true. So let me just put the tales in some sort of context. As you probably know, the big controversy about the history of childhood is whether such a thing as childhood has always existed, or whether it was something put together in the 17th and 18th century. The idea being that before that, you had your children, they worked in the household, they wore cut-down adult clothes, they had the same food as you, they couldn't read, neither could you. They were just little mini adults. That was the theory. And when they were babies, they were swaddled so tight, the swaddling clothes were taken off once a day, and you could literally hang a baby up on a hook. When Shakespeare describes babies crying, he says the word mewing. And if you're swaddled and you're round the chest, all you've got is very shallow breathing, which would be very good for keeping this child in a sort of coma for the first 18 months. Anyhow, now this has been disputed by other historians who say that because people didn't keep diaries or write letters in a pre-literate age, we can't know that they didn't love their children, and there's evidence from lullabies, nursery rhymes, playing with fingers and toes and things, that since there was another side to being a parent. But I think probably we could agree that there was a very harsh time for many children. And of course, for many working class children, that would persist right up to the end of the 19th century, where my own grandfather, for example, was alive when there were still children being shoved up chimneys. And you could go to St. Paul's and children would come and try to sell you flowers, just as they do if you go to South America today. But anyhow, by the time the Grimms were putting their tales together, there was a definite change in the air, because at that stage it made more sense to have an educated child who could go into perhaps one of the professions than to simply think that the child will imitate whatever the father does and carry on the family line, ploughing, being a butcher, or whatever. So you took children out of the economic cycle, you put them into education, you invested in them with the hope of getting a nice return when they could then join a guild of merchants or whatever you do when you're successful as an adult. But as I said, there were still two attitudes, I think, and in a sense there still are, I think, towards children, a sort of sympathetic one and a rather less sympathetic one. So looking at the tales from that point of view, what were the Grimms picking out for being a parent? Well, as I said, I think because of Hansel and Gretel, that sort of coloured almost everybody's reaction to all the fairy tales. The idea that parents could simply take children out and abandon them, which of course did happen. But looking at the other tales, you find something quite different. For example, there's lots of kings and queens in the Grimm tales. Now, you could say that being the child of a king and queen is not a typical childhood, and you've got to, invest in that child to keep the dynasty going. But nevertheless, quite a few stories about kings and queens whose usually a princess disappears or goes silent or something, and how loved they are, and how devastated the parents are when this has happened. And there are various stories of lost characters in the Grimms, and then they're always lost children. There's also stories about parents who haven't got children and are longing for a child. Now, of course, there's another dynastic feature here. You want to leave your money to somebody. But even so, I think it's impossible to read the stories right through, which I did for this talk, without feeling that there's plenty of representation of parental love there, and the right of a child to be loved. And although, as I intimated, this change was gradually happening, it was still contested, and I think we should give the Grimms credit for coming out on the side that they did. Now, even in the Grimm stories featuring poor peasant families with large families, love between the parents or the grandparents and the children is still mentioned, and also this longing for a child, which has not arrived so far. There's also love described between brothers and sisters, although there are some stories where jealousy comes in to spoil the picture. And the childhoods you get in the Grimms aren't all work, even if you're a poor peasant, a poor woodcutter. So you can find descriptions of children playing with other children in the meadow, sometimes collecting flowers in the forest when their parents had gone to get firewood, and generally having the sort of childhood you rather hoped that would have been possible at that time. Now, it's not all rosy. There's no patience in the tales for lazy children, and there's barely concealed impatience with stupid ones. Well, you can see why, can't you? At a time when people didn't know much psychology, words like lazy and stupid just had this strong moralistic overtones. There's also no tolerance of mischievous children. And I think that's quite an interesting one, I think. The idea of the mischievous child as hero, you had to wait for Richmond Crompton's William to come along. Before that was so. Before that, if a mischievous child teased another or kicked over a vase and broke it, that was economic, a real threat to the family economy. You can't afford to have children out of control when you're just getting by. So once you get to Richmond Crompton, last century, the William books, William lives in a cosy suburban house. His father, I don't know what he does, but he's a businessman, there's plenty of money. So all William's mischief is a threat to the sort of tolerance of his parents, but it's not an economic threat. Also, in the Grimms, you do have favourite children, favourites among children, which was anathema to people like you now. But it wasn't so long ago, it really wasn't so long ago, when people could ask parents, who's your favourite? And if you've got, say, 12 or 13 children, it's almost perhaps inevitable that one might, of all the time being claimed from you by the others, one might get a little bit more than the others just because there's something about them that you particularly like. Now, poverty and the threat of starvation is never very far away from some of the tales, with parents dreading the arrival of more children that they can't feed. And of course, the great example of that is Hansel and Gretel. In the first draft, the parents decide to abandon their children because there simply isn't enough food to go round. Now again, you've got to think yourself back into a time when, if the harvest failed, there simply wasn't enough food. So, you know, it's nothing you can sort of do about it. You can't go and buy tinned food or anything like that. All your stores might have gone. Now, what do you do? Well, the Romans didn't think twice about exposing their unwanted babies, sometimes for quite trivial reasons. Now, Christian Europe took a different view, but when starvation and death were imminent, there are some very difficult questions to answer. Who's going to be sacrificed, the child or the provider? Now, as it is, child abandonment and infanticide were a factor in Europe when the Grimms were working on their collection. And some figures suggest that up to 20% of babies in urban areas were still being abandoned when times were desperately hard. And there'd been a famine in Hesse, where the Grimms were based, within living memory. So, it's a disturbing picture, but it's a different sort of picture, I think, then than it might seem now. But the Grimms were collecting their tales when conditions are beginning to improve. And so I think you find, when you look through them, that they didn't really want to have the savage and coarse material that might still have been at their disposal, the rougher fare. So they still put in Hansel and Gretel, but they were obviously disturbed by it. And that's why the Grimms changed the mother who abandoned the children in the first 1812 text to become the stepmother in the 7th edition in 1857. Now, the father, who's a real weed, gets away scot-free. And if you see the the opera Hansel and Gretel. He's totally two-faced. He sort of lets the mother get on with this terrible scheme, then he's all loving and things at the end when he finds the children. And so the Grimms have had a very bad press, I think, because shifting the blame from the father to the mother is not particularly a gallant thing to do. But even so, they were still in the process, I think, of softening this tale. So at least if you end up with one parent who shows love and remorse for the children, well and good. As for the other, the mother, you change her into the stepmother. And in doing so, I won't say they started a trend, but they were part of a trend which continues to haunt children's literature up to today. And that is when you transfer blame or evil from biological parents to step-parents. And this happens very often. You've probably all read many stories of wicked step-parents yourself. It's not easy being a step-parent today, and it's probably not made any easier by the fact that your image in literature is such an extremely negative one. Now, one or two really interesting modern writers have written more sympathetically about being a step-parent. And there's also an Icelandic folk tale with the title, The Tale of Hilda, the Good Stepmother, mentioned by Maria Tatar in her book, The Hard Facts of Grimm's Fairy Tales. And I think just for me to read that title to you, The Tale of Hilda, the Good Stepmother. Good stepmother, we don't have very many of those, particularly in fairy tales. And again, I can see you could make a case for saying it's impossible for a biological mother to wish evil on her children. I mean, it's not, but it's more consoling to your young readers if you say something like that. And then you split all the evil over into a convenient stepmother, which I've always thought is not a terribly honest way out. I'm not alone. In 1856, Ludwig Bechstein wrote in his preface to his new book of German fairy tales, "Among the thousands of children who every year get their hands on books of fairy tales, there must be many so-called stepchildren. When such a child, after reading many a fairy tale in which stepmothers appear, the stepmothers are all uniformly evil, feel that it has been somehow injured or insulted by his own stepmother, then that young person makes comparisons and develops a strong aversion to his guardian." Now, Bechstein, in 1856, the sort of child psychology around that time would suggest that anything you read, you take on board. The idea that you filter messages through books according to your own dynamic had to wait some time. But even so, there were people around at the time, I think, who did find that this demonization of the step-parent too easy a way out, and not particularly healthy one. And I've said this in print elsewhere, and I became tangled with some evolutionary psychologists who are convinced that if you look at the statistics now, there are many more injuries sustained by children of step-parents than children of biological parents. And they think it's an evolutionary imperative that, you know, you want to protect your genes. If it's your biological child, if it's your stepchild, you've got no genetic investment, so let the world go hang. Now, I have great problems with that, because I think when you look at the incidence of step-parents abusing children, and then you filter out things like poverty, mental health, and so on, I think it looks much less convincing. But that's something that, if any of you are interested, you might want to follow up elsewhere. Anyhow, in all events, the presence of the wicked step-parent in some of the Grimm's tales means that the Grimms can then describe the sort of cruelty they wanted to avoid, I think, when they're describing biological families. So in the Grimm's tales, nearly all the beatings, the kickings, the inadequate food, the rough sleeping conditions, the blame for that are laid at the step-parents and sometimes the bratish offspring of those same step-parents. And elsewhere, there are hints of less palatable biological parents. For example, there's an incestuous father in this fairy tale I can never pronounce. It's translated as the coat of many colours. But mostly in the tales we see biological parents trying to do their best. Evil is found in malign witches, dishonest servants, deceitful stepchildren, or most often of all, evil stepmothers. Not so much evil stepfathers, curiously enough. And it could be argued that the threat from a wicked father or stepfather has a potential sexual dimension, which isn't there with the stepmother. And one ingenious suggestion could be that you avoid wicked fathers and stepfathers because to actually have them in print or to record them in print is to put something down which you really haven't got much control over and which could, be very, very upsetting to children. And I mean, this is another lecture, but I mean, when you look at the instances of sexual abuse within families, and then you look for any indication in children's literature that such a thing is possible, it is still a pretty taboo subject. Now, the wish fulfillment quotient in Grimm has always been high, because why else would poor and dispossessed adult and children have kept these stories going for so long in the oral tradition before they got into print? Horrors are not always avoided, such as references to cannibalism, but they're made less frightening by only occurring when evil spirits are involved. In fact, genuine cannibalism was not unknown in Europe in the 30 Years' War. And there would have been a folk memory of incidents of cannibalism, just as I'm afraid that would have been in the 20th century in certain places and areas too. But in the world of the Grimm's fairy tales, no one wants to get quite as close to reality as that. For me, there's one extra reason why the Grimm's stories concentrate on children who are comparatively well treated by their natural parents. Death within a Grimm's fairy tale is often reversible, and if a blameless child is murdered, there's always a chance they might come back later on to give damning evidence against the perpetrator. And this is, I think, a very interesting way in which folklore is different from novels. In novels, the great Victorian novels, the dying child is a sort of almost like a religious phenomenon. They see heaven before they're about to die, and when they die, everybody says, what a frightfully good thing it is that they're now in so much a better place, which seems perverse, having tried to stop this child dying a minute before. In folk tales, the dead child is often a threat, particularly if they haven't been buried in sanctified ground. And even now, if you go to see The Woman in Black or various, I can mention a few American films, the idea of a child spirit is just as frightening, an out-of-control child spirit, as the idea of an adult one. Now, there's two Grimm fairy tales which I think take up this fantasy. One is The Little Shroud, and the other is called The Lost Farthings. And they both refer to a much-loved but dead small boy revisiting his parents every night, urging them to put right some unfinished business that was not allowing him to sleep quietly in his grave. Now, isn't it interesting that once upon a time you would be scared of this as a possible agent coming to haunt you? Today, we have parental guilt over the way we neglect our children. In the Grimm's time, I think this guilt was more often coming back in the shape of spirits and ghosts, which were an unsettling prospect, and therefore one which is quite nice to put to sleep in their stories. So, I would myself see the Grimm's stories as largely on the side of the child, at a time when things were changing, but there were still desperately needed improvements where routine violence, neglect, and psychological cruelty was concerned. I think that Grimm's liked selecting stories which showed parents largely in better lights, in keeping with the spirit of their age. And so they tended to purge their stories of things they found objectionable: successful crime, sex, suicide, illegitimate birth, wanton violence. And by softening the past, they made their stories more acceptable to parents and children. And let's give them credit, perhaps they thought that they were setting a good example at the same time. They also favoured stories where males took a more active role than women, and they preferred not to dwell on the horrors of the past. And I think they were in touch with their audience there. We all like turning our back on unpleasant things, and they hit on a particularly successful formula. They preserved the tales, they sometimes refreshed them by rewriting them, and they filtered out the details they thought were too gross, and they introduced their great collection to an audience that couldn't get enough of it. We don't necessarily go to them now for realism about how they describe families, and I'm not sure how much the tales could tell us about how children were treated at the time. But they do, stories tell us a lot, I think, about the brothers themselves and their preferred attitudes to children, whether such attitudes were shared widely in their social classes or not. I think we go to them for fantasy, and I think we also relish the fact that there's just this hint under them of an underlying, not so happy world, which is sort of kept at bay, but it's always there, there's little hints in the background. And if I was to compare the Grimms with anybody working in fairy tales now, or for the last 50 years, I think it would be with Walt Disney. Because Walt Disney, again, took the tales, he softened them even further than the Grimms did, and he gave them a new life. If it wasn't for the film of Snow White and the songs that went with it, I wonder if that story would still be around now, in our consciousness. Just as, children are not brought up on fairy tales anymore, nor do they know all the nursery rhymes they used to know. And it's also interesting that in this film of Snow White, Disney used Arthur Rackham, a great Victorian painter who actually died while the film was being made. And if you see the first part of it, all the trees when Snow White's running through the forest all bend over and leer at her. That's pure Arthur Rackham. And a lot of kids, including me, were quite scared by that film. So again, I think Disney sort of had a conscience. He didn't want to totally negate the frightening aspects of that film. And the result was some nightmares for children when they were small, but a very engaging film later on. Right. Now comes a little postscript for you all. We'll fast forward now to 1945. And we're in Germany, and split between different Allied zones, trying to sort of rebuild a broken country where a lot of people were dying of starvation. But with all that work and the denazification you had to do and all the other things, there's still time for the Allied command to ban the publication of Grimm's fairy tales. And the British government sent a memorandum to all the schools in its area asking them to avoid Grimm's tales. And again, Hansel and Gretel comes up, doesn't it? Because don't forget what Gretel does to the witch. She goes into an oven. A British major called T.J. Leonard, he wrote at the time that the tales had helped Germans to teach their children all the varieties of barbarism, make it easier for them to fit the role of the hangman. Now that is fairly strong stuff, isn't it? And the ban was lifted the next year. People might have remembered by then that all the time children in America and Britain were also reading the Grimm's tales without necessarily taking on the role of the hangman. Though to be fair to the Allies in 1945, the Grimm's tales by that stage had been heavily doctored by the Nazis to bring out the anti-Semitism and the cruelty and to play down the humanism of them, just as the Weimar Republic before the Nazis had pretty well done the opposite. The Americans, for their part, purged Grimm stories from their schools and libraries in their area, and all the editions were taken back to America. I have to ask Jack what happened to them when they got back to America. But it would be very ironic if they'd been burned. Because if you see a flickering newsreel of Nazis burning books in Berlin in 1930, 4, 35, whatever it was. If you go to Berlin now, the place where that happened has a little flame burning underneath the surface with a glass thing over it to commemorate this famous bonfire. And a lot of those books were children's books, because the Nazis, with their deification of nature and natural things, thought that any picture book which had an animal dressed up in human clothes was a terrible insult to the natural world. So a lot of those books, it wasn't Freud and Marx referring in, it was sort of Mr. Chimp has a tea party or something. And Mike Rosen, former children's laureate, he's now very involved in the Brighton Festival, and in the Brighton Festival he's making Eric Kastner, author of Emil and the Detectives, he's making Emil and the Detectives a sort of leitmotif for his bit at the festival. And he swears that when you see that newsreel of people throwing in books into the bonfire, he swears that if you listen, you never go, Kastner, Kastner, because all Eric Kastner's books were burnt as well at that particular time. But what do we think then of this reaction after the war? It's very strange, isn't it? Because after the war, when academics, many academics, with Jack, the last of a very distinguished line of people writing about the Grimms, they've not been uncritical. But what they write about is the Grimms' rigid attitudes, very stark attitudes towards punishment, the way that violence always comes from outsiders, avaricious merchants, wily Jews, the emphasis on courage above everything else. And there's a particularly repellent 1930 animated film made by the Nazis called The Boy Who Wanted to Know What Fair Was. And this little boy, it's animated, but he just simply chops up animals and has a really sort of good time being foul to everybody, and he's raised as some sort of example. But all this post-war unease with the Grimms wasn't at all about the actual attitude of children themselves. Nobody picked that up because I don't think there was anything to pick up. And yet, in a very sad way, there was something, wasn't there? Because Hitler, for example, was a very unloved child, notoriously beaten every day by his father. But many of the many of the notorious Nazis seem to have had perfectly happy childhoods themselves. And that didn't stop them from becoming the monsters that they then became. And so, in a sense, perhaps what you get from the Grimms is an emphasis on loving children and children loving parents back. But history telling us that however desirable it is to read about this in fiction, and however consoling, and whatever the good example set, that loving your children and being loved back isn't always quite enough.
Time now for any responses, comments, questions.
What would you feel about Marina Warner's view that the reason there are so many wicked stepmothers was that the incidence of mothers dying in childbirth meant there were a lot of grannies whose position was threatened by a new stepmother, hence they made the stepmother the villain of the piece because their own daughter perhaps was the one who would actually die.
Yeah, I know the theory, but I think it's just as likely, I think, that the grandmother could tell a story about a young woman who's unpleasant just because she's old and the daughter or the stepdaughter, whatever the house is giving the orders now. So the old lady is relegated to the far side, and her only power left is stories, which they do very well. But I wouldn't especially expect a very rosy view of anybody from stories told by very old people who might feel a bit marginalised at that stage.
You mentioned that the Nazis adopted the Grimm stories to reduce the humanism in them and bring out nasty aspects. I just wondered if you could give an example of a change like that they made.
Now, you see, you're sitting next to a chap who can answer that question so much better than I can. Because Jack knows more about the Grimms than the Grimms themselves. Now, Jack, could you answer that question?
Well, they actually didn't doctor the tales. What they did was they framed them in a way that brought out sort of the Aryan philosophy. So they would just focus on particular tales. They really didn't want to change them because of the fact that they believed that these were tales that represented the German tradition, and we don't touch that because they're generally Aryan. So what they did was the illustrations might reflect something, and they couldn't use every tale because not all the tales really represented their philosophy. So basically, they were very selective, and they obviously chose particular tales that would assist them in spreading sort of the Nazi philosophy.
But, Jack, that story, The Jew Among Fawns.
Oh yeah,
that in the original Grimm, the Grimm versions, there's some sympathy towards him, isn't there? That you shouldn't just beat up somebody. I can't believe the Nazis wouldn't have allowed that through, this message about just because he's a Jew, he's all right to beat him up.
No, it's a pretty brutal tale.
Yeah.
But so they had no difficulty with that. There was another tale in the Grimm collection, was how the day brought things to light, and it's a tale about a man who beats up a Jew.
Yeah.
And he dies. The Jew dies, and then the truth comes out, and the man is punished. So, in other words, there are just two tales that deal with Jews in the entire collection. One of them is very anti-Semitic, and one is very philo-Semitic. So,
and would the Nazis have let the second one?
Oh no,
no. So that would be my one example, but by omission.
Yes, they would omit it from the collections.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm reading the modern picture books of Grimm stories to my daughter, and I read Hansel and Gretel, and in this version, the mother was just the mother, not a stepmother, but the Wicked Witch had cast a spell on her to make her send her children out into the forest. And I was wondering, at what stage, since the Grimms we received the translations, did we realise that it was bad to deliver this message that step-parents were evil?
I don't know. I think writers are a little bit more careful now. But there's a very good production of Hansel and Gretel at Glyndebourne about 2 years ago. And when the witch takes the children in, they don't get turned into stone. She, in fact, runs a supermarket, and all the children are grossly obese. And they all come out in their fat suits at the end. So the opera has taken overfeeding now as the equivalent of 18th century starvation as a way of abusing children. There's all sorts of problems with being a witch. As I was going to say in fiction, I wrote something about this once, and my guess is that almost all the witches in fiction, modern fiction, are benign. They're scatty, they can't work their spells, they're sort of good fun, really. The really wicked ones, I think people have a bit more of a conscience about them now, particularly with studies suggesting, the sort of hysteria that went into the witch trials and so on. And going back to Disney, I think that the image when the beautiful queen, who's supposed to be based on the Duchess of Windsor, when she changes into a witch, she is the absolute archetypal witch, a real throwback, I think, to really horrible attitudes. But I've said this in your great magazine over there, I think you can be quite funny about witches in Britain now, because on the whole we don't believe in them. But if you go out to Uganda, where there is still a very vibrant belief in witchcraft, with poor children being expelled from the home and made homeless because people call them witches, then, I wouldn't be reading any Grimm fairy tales over there for some time. Yes, right, my opponent.
I was about to agree enthusiastically and to remind you that one of the criticisms of the Grimms in the immediate post-war period in Germany was precisely on this matter of witchcraft. There was a man called Johann Kruse who lived in the North German provinces where belief in witchcraft was still absolutely living in the village societies. Women were being persecuted and, their cats and dogs killed, excrement smeared all over their windows and doors, their daughters stoned in the street and so on, because they were supposed to be witches. And Kruse wrote a whole book called Die Hexen unter uns about this. And one of the points he makes is that the folklorists are to blame to some extent, because Grimm and other folktale collections were being published, and the people would say, oh yes, but you see, it's perfectly true, there are witches. So-and-so, professor of such and such university, has published a book about them, and it would be a commentary on Grimm's fairy tales. and he's really quite passionate about the guilt of folklorists in this persecution that was going on in the North German provinces in the 1950s.
Well, well.
Hexen und Terms, Johann Kruse.
I don't think it's been translated, has it?
No, it hasn't.
No, but well, there we are. Certainly, there was a play on in London about 5 years ago called The Weir, and it was set in an Irish bar, and each man working there had his own ghost story, and they were put over in terms of total belief, and also it was quite scary. You'd be surprised if you see anything written by people who only just left, or perhaps not quite left, an active belief in the supernatural. It can be curiously convincing. But there we go. Sorry, go on.
I have one more thing that I'd like to say, I meant to say at the end of my lecture and quite forgot. This is a postscript to my lecture, not this one. If you want to see Kevin, he's on television tomorrow night, 9 o'clock, BBC 2. It's a program called Facing Extinction. It's partly about the orangutans of Borneo, and it's partly about his own death. 9 o'clock, BBC 2 tomorrow.
What are you going to think?
I just wonder what you thought about the recurrence of these kind of ghostly children. The film like The Orphanage came out a couple of years ago. These terrifying kids wandering around with bags on their heads in the night in this orphanage. And I was really surprised by how scared I was.
Yes.
I wonder what you thought, why this seems to be a recurrent thing, doesn't it? It comes back every so often. Why at the moment would that be? It's amazing the number of people who said that scene when a kid turns up with a bag on his head in the corridor.
Yes.
Has anyone seen that? Yeah. It's amazing how many people are scared by it.
Yes.
What do you think the reason for that might be that it's come back now?
Well, I know quite a few parents who are actually terrified of their children. Perhaps more so now that the sort of ordinary disciplinary framework has pretty well broken down. And it may be something to do with that, or the fact that, how much do children cost you? £90,000 or something? And if all you're getting in return is abuse and law breaking, then I can see that, your fear of what you've actually brought into the world, you don't perhaps want to face up to that yourself, but seeing a film like The Orphanage, it will all come out there, but that's just one theory.
It's very unfair, though, when you think about what a mess we've made of the world, and the kids have to deal with it.
Absolutely right. Quite right.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
John.
In terms of contemporary literature, you made me think about Philip Pullman trilogy and how sort of somehow shocking it is for us that Lyra's both her parents, her biological parents, are such terrifying beings.
Yeah.
And it seems. Would you say that Pullman is actually doing something which goes against the tradition of 19th and 20th century fairy tale fantasy?
I think there's, dare I say, there's a bit of autobiography in all that. But he's basically brought up by his grandparents. His mother was a glamorous figure in London who he saw for some weekends. And I think if you read some of his other novels, not the Heart of Darkness ones, the Darkness Visible ones, you'll find other mothers who are pretty dubious. His father, he hardly knew, but there's sort of stories about him too. So I think that's more autobiographical than an agenda. But since you mentioned Philip, one of the books that he's most inspired by for his Darkness Visible trilogy was in fact Emma and the Detectives. And he saw the film of it, which we were going to show in Brighton. And it's this whole idea of a gang of children operating, working class children, operating a sort of system of justice apart from the adult world and bringing it all. So.
Thank you again. If no more questions, for a very could I say provocative? Very interesting, controversial, opened many ways of thinking which I